You are not going to believe this. My neighbor actually called the cops on me just because I refused to sell the cabin I inherited from my aunt. And get this, her son stormed up my driveway demanding I hand over my property so he could film his ridiculous treasure hunting videos. When I told him no, his mother, the HOA president, filed a false police report claiming I threatened them. Can you imagine? 3 years of minding my own business, and suddenly I'm painted as the neighborhood villain. But here's the thing. They had no idea who they were dealing with. And they definitely didn't realize that our quiet little lake community was about to collide with something much darker. Before I dive in, smash that like button and subscribe to Listen HOA Stories, so you don't miss the shocking truth of how this fight spiraled out of control. Now, let me take you back to the start. It was supposed to be just another peaceful Monday at the cabin. My name's Thomas Harris, and this lakeside place has been my escape for years. But instead of calm, I found Jake Evans in my driveway with a trailer full of underwater cameras, looking like he was about to film a Discovery Channel special. His manic energy set off every instinct from my federal training, but I'll admit his passion was almost infectious at first. Jake launched into this pitch about needing my dock for a treasure hunting series. He said my property was the only one on the lake with the deep water rights his equipment required. At first, it sounded harmless, maybe even exciting. But as he spoke, I saw something else: desperation. His hands shook, his voice cracked, and he kept talking about contracts, lost money, and consequences if he didn't deliver. Then he dropped the line that changed everything. The people I owe money to, they don't take excuses. That was the moment my gut told me this wasn't about YouTube videos. This was about survival. And just when I thought it couldn't get stranger, his mother Lavra arrived. Picture this: a woman in a perfectly pressed suit marching up my driveway like she owned the land under my feet. She introduced herself as Lavra Evans, president of the Lake Community HOA. Her handshake was fake, her smile faker, and within 2 minutes she was lecturing me about community standards and property values. What she was really doing? Threatening me subtly, but unmistakably. What she didn't know was that her threats were about to backfire in ways she couldn't imagine. Because the so-called serious business people Jake owed money to, they were the very same criminals I was investigating as part of a 6-month federal case. And me? I wasn't just some reclusive cabin owner. I was a federal agent running surveillance out of that very house. As Lavra and Jake finally pulled out of my driveway, I caught something I wasn't supposed to hear. Lavra leaned close to her son and whispered, "We have other options. Sometimes you have to use the system to get what you deserve." Jake nodded like a bobblehead, wiping his tears and rambling about documenting everything to prove the world was against him. That's when the chill hit me. This wasn't over. These two weren't walking away, they were gearing up for round 2. And with Laura's legal background and Jake's unstable state of mind, I knew things were about to get complicated fast. But here's what really stuck with me. A few of the creditor names Lavra mentioned sounded disturbingly familiar. I couldn't shake the feeling I'd seen them before in my case files, and holy. Let me tell you what happened next. The very next morning, instead of peace and quiet, I woke up to a full-blown surveillance operation, except it wasn't the feds, it was Laura and Jake. She'd spent the entire night digging through my life like a bloodhound in a law library. When I spotted her across the street, sitting in her car at 7 a.m. with a laptop and stacks of documents, it was clear she thought she was building a case against me. Property records, license searches, probably even my credit history spread out on her dashboard. Meanwhile, Jake had gone full spy thriller, sneaking around my cabin at night with his phone on night mode, rustling through the bushes so loudly I could track him from my living room. The irony? He was so busy trying to catch me doing something shady, He completely missed the real surveillance gear hidden around my property. That's when Frank Torres, my neighbor, started making, let's just say, unusual comments. Things like federal, coordination protocols, and patterns of activity. At first, I chalked it up to nosiness, but Frank knew way too much for a retired civilian. My instincts screamed. He wasn't just another curious neighbor. Then came the game changer. Jake pushed his little spy act too far one night, creeping right up to my window. He tripped my motion sensors, panicked, and bolted. In his rush, he dropped his phone square in my driveway. And that mistake? That was the turning point. Because when I picked it up and started scrolling, my blood ran cold. Jake had weeks of surveillance footage, not just of me, but of the entire lake. Boat traffic, visitor schedules, even government plates and federal vehicles. The kid had unknowingly documented my team's surveillance ops. If those clips got into the wrong hands, they could blow the entire federal investigation wide open. And buried in his texts and voicemails? Threats, demands, names I knew all too well, the exact criminals my 6-month investigation was targeting. Jake wasn't just in debt to some random loan sharks. He was tangled up with the very money launderers I'd been chasing for months. The next morning, Lavra stormed back to my door like a prosecutor heading into court. She tried spinning this wild story. Jake had been legally photographing from public areas, and I was the one stealing his property. She even waved around what looked like a legal document, threatening theft charges if I didn't hand the phone over. What she didn't know was that I'd already gone through it. I knew about their creditors, their deadline, and how dangerously close their little harassment campaign had come to blowing a federal case wide open. This wasn't just a neighborhood squabble anymore. This was a national security issue, and as I stared into Laura's cold, desperate eyes, she dropped the mask completely. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," she hissed. "I've been practicing law in this county for 20 years. I know every judge, every cop, every clerk." For the first time, I realized Lavra Evans wasn't just a pushy OA president. She was about to weaponize the entire system against me. You ever deal with neighbors who don't just cross the line? They erase it completely? Well, buckle up, because this next part of the story is about to get intense. And hey, before we dive in, make sure you hit that subscribe button to listen HOA stories so you don't miss what happens when the law, desperation, and federal investigations collide. Lavra completely misjudged me. To her, I was just some antisocial tech worker with fancy gadgets she could bully into submission. She had no clue that the toys she dismissed were federal surveillance tools, and that I wasn't some recluse, but a federal agent who had been watching her son accidentally collect evidence on a criminal network. Our meeting ended with Lavra hissing threats, promising this was far from over. She bragged about her 20 years practicing law in the county, knowing every judge, clerk, and cop like they were chess pieces she could move at will. Meanwhile, Jake sulked in the car, twitchy and frantic, terrified about the phone he'd dropped because he knew exactly what was on it. And trust me, so did I. But Lavra wasn't done. Oh no. Since intimidation hadn't worked, she decided to escalate, dragging in Sheriff Mike Stone to make things official. The woman spun a whole fantasy about Jake being some innocent hobby photographer whose phone I'd supposedly stolen after terrifying him. She even whipped out bogus legal documents to make it look legitimate. I'll give her credit, the act was polished. But then came the unraveling. Sheriff Stone started asking questions, and Jake cracked like glass under pressure. His story shifted from landscapes to spying on my property, then to investigating my suspicious activities. He babbled about government plates, strange phone calls, and how I must be hiding something valuable. Then, slip of the century, he blurted out that he owed money to serious people. The sheriff and I locked eyes, and in that silence, Jake realized his mistake. Suddenly, the whole rotten truth spilled out. He and Lavra weren't just nosy neighbors. They were drowning in debt to the same organized crime figures I'd been. Investigating for 6 months. Vincent Morone, Anthony Russo, Maria Santos. Not loan sharks, money launderers running vacation rental scams around the very lake we lived on. At that moment, everything made sense. Their harassment, their desperation, their obsession with my cabin. This wasn't about entitlement, it was about survival. They thought bullying me into selling was their only way out. Before their business associates decided to collect payment the hard way, Sheriff Stone did his job. He made it clear Jake's trespassing made the phone legally mine, warned Lavra about filing false reports, and told Jake to stay away. But I knew this was just the start. Because desperate people backed into a corner, they don't stop. They get dangerous. And trust me, you're going to want to see what they tried next. So don't forget to hit like, share, and subscribe too. Listen HOA Stories, because the next chapter takes this neighborhood nightmare to a level you won't believe. As Lavra and Jake pulled away, Sheriff Mike Stone lingered. He leaned in, voice low. Thomas, I don't know what your deal is, but these people are scared of more than just money. If the names that kid mentioned are who I think they are, this family is in real danger. You might want to lock things down tighter. What Mike didn't realize was I already knew those names. Vincent Morone, Anthony Russo, Maria Santos. Not small-time crooks. Federal targets I'd been building a case against for 6 months. Jake hadn't just exposed his debts, he had tied himself directly to the very criminals my team had been tracking. The second Mike drove off, I was on the secure line with Jane. We've got a problem. Remember those targets we've been chasing? One of my neighbors just admitted to owing them money. And his mother? She's been digging into my background nonstop. Jane's pause was long, heavy. Thomas, please tell me you're not saying what I think you're saying. But that's exactly what I was saying. My cover wasn't just at risk, it was dangling by a thread. Suddenly, our operation timeline wasn't months, it was days. Maybe hours. Here's the twisted irony. For months, we'd been desperate for inside intel on Marone's crew, their recruitment, their financial pressure tactics, their structure. And here was Jake Evans, this erratic kid who thought he was harassing me, unknowingly handing us surveillance gold. His obsession with me wasn't just a nuisance anymore, it was intelligence. But one detail gnawed at me. Jake had said his business associates knew Laura's schedule and where they lived. That wasn't an idle threat. That meant active surveillance, which also meant these criminals likely knew about Jake's spying, Laura's background checks, and maybe even me. What if Jake and Lavra weren't acting on their own paranoia? What if Marone's crew had steered them toward me on purpose because they already suspected who I was? 2 days later, I got my answer in the most absurd way possible. I was in my office when I heard this weird buzzing outside. At first, I thought it was a wasp or maybe yard work across the lake. Nope. I opened the blinds, and there it was, Jake's shiny new $300 drone, hovering 20 feet above my cabin like it was auditioning for a spy thriller. Kid was down on the beach, grinning like he just leveled up in a video game. What Jake didn't know: my cabin isn't just wired. It's fortified with federal-grade counter-surveillance systems. Totally legal for me, but to any civilian, it'd look like Area 51 tech. Within 30 seconds of entering my airspace, Jake's drone had a nervous breakdown. My jamming system fried the signal, forcing it into emergency return mode. Except his phone controller was jammed too. The poor thing spun, wobbled, and crash-landed right in my front yard with a crunch that probably cost Jake a month's allowance. The neighborhood went nuts. Bob Martinez sprinted out with his camera, recording the chaos. Jennifer Parker gathered her kids to watch the mystery fireworks. And David Carter, ex-military, just stared at my property with this look like he was connecting puzzle pieces. He knew what he'd just seen. Jake came tearing across the sand, screaming like I'd shot his pet. That drone cost me $300. You can't just shoot down aircraft with illegal military jammers. His meltdown was being recorded by Bob the whole time, and I could see the neighbors exchanging looks. That's not home security. David muttered to Bob, that's government grade signal jamming. And he was right. 10 minutes later, Laura showed up, red-faced and furious. Mr. Harris, you've just committed a federal crime. The FCC has strict regulations about signal jamming equipment, and I guarantee you whatever you're running is in violation of multiple laws. The irony was almost laughable. Here she was, threatening to report me to the feds for using actual federal equipment as part of an ongoing federal investigation. But the real bombshell wasn't Laura's theatrics. It was what I found when I retrieved the drone's memory card, which, by law, I had every right to do since it had been flown illegally over my property. On it, weeks of aerial surveillance covering the entire lake, not just my cabin. Not just random footage, but clear, systematic records of properties, boat traffic, and movements that intersected directly with my case. Jake thought he was spying on me. In reality, he was accidentally doing reconnaissance for a federal operation. And this was just the beginning. You know what's scarier than entitled neighbors? Entitled neighbors who accidentally uncover a federal investigation. And if you thought the drone incident was peak chaos, buckle up, because things were about to go from HOA drama to full-blown organized crime in broad daylight. But before I get into it, make sure to hit subscribe to listen HOA stories, so you don't miss stories that prove sometimes the people living next door aren't just annoying. They're dangerous. Jake hadn't just been snooping on my cabin. Without even realizing it, he'd put together a full-blown reconnaissance package on every property around the lake. His drone footage mapped out visitor schedules, boat traffic, and operations at rental homes I knew were fronts for laundering cash. In a matter of weeks, he'd accidentally done the work it would have taken my entire federal team months to collect legally. The neighbors were starting to connect dots. 2. David's sharp eye caught my countermeasure system in action. That kind of jamming, you don't just buy it off Amazon. That's federal grade. Bob kept filming like his YouTube career depended on it. Jennifer leaned in to whisper, 3 years he's lived here. No parties, no noise, but gear that can drop a drone out of the sky? Either he's a contractor or something way bigger. Meanwhile, Jake was absolutely losing it in my driveway. This is persecution. You can't just destroy people's property to cover your illegal activities. I'll report you to the FCC, the FAA, the FBI. You're not above the law. The irony? He was shouting about the FBI while standing 20 feet from active FBI surveillance equipment. Lavra doubled down with her lawyer routine, rattling off threats: destruction of property, intimidation of civilians, illegal use of jamming devices. I'll have every agency in Washington crawling over you. She had no idea I already did answer to Washington. And every piece of equipment she was ranting about had been authorized for this exact mission. By the time they left, Jake was muttering about electronic warfare laws, and Lavra was furiously dialing half the Federal Registry. The neighbors? They were buzzing with speculation about the quiet tech worker who suddenly looked more like a spook than a software consultant. But the real problem? David. His military-trained eyes weren't just guessing, he knew exactly what he was looking at. Which meant my cover wasn't just fraying with Lavra and Jake. It was slipping with the entire neighborhood. Still, that was nothing compared to what happened next. 3 days later, I made what I thought would be a routine grocery run. I was loading bags into my truck when I heard raised voices across the parking lot. At first, I figured it was just some customer service spat. Then I saw them, Laura and Jake, cornered against their car by two men who were definitely not locals. These guys had the look. Expensive suits stretched over concealed weapons, military posture, and the cold confidence of people who'd hurt others for money before. "Days, Evans," one said in a low, icy tone. "Vincent gave you 3 days to deliver, and here we are. Empty hands, excuses." The second man leaned in on Jake, who was shaking so badly I could see it from 30 feet away. "Deadlines aren't suggestions, kid. They're promises. And Vincent always keeps his promises." And hearing that name Vincent hit me like a gunshot. Vincent Morone. One of the main federal targets I've been chasing for months. This wasn't just HOA harassment anymore. This was a live federal target threatening my neighbors in broad daylight at a grocery store, in front of families and kids. Jennifer Parker was there with her children, hustling them inside with wide, terrified eyes. Bob Martinez was in his car, frozen but reaching for his phone to record. David Carter's military instincts kicked in, positioning himself to shield civilians while keeping just far enough back not to escalate. The men weren't just threatening. They were giving orders. "That lake cabin you've been obsessed with? Vincent thinks the owner might be motivated to sell. With the right pressure. You've got resources. Use them. Resources. Pressure." They weren't talking about negotiation. They were talking about weaponizing Laura and Jake's obsession with me to solve their debt problem. And in that moment, it hit me. This wasn't a random debt collection. This was a direct attempt by Morone's crew to turn my neighbors into pawns. And the clock on my cover story? It just hit 0. What kind of resources was Vincent Morone talking about? Resources to pressure me, a federal agent, into selling my property. The kind of resources that didn't come with contracts or polite negotiations, but threats, intimidation, and blood. Laura tried to keep her composure, though her voice betrayed the fear in her chest. "I'm working on it. Harris is being unreasonable, but I have options that will force his cooperation. These things take time." Imagine the irony. This woman was standing in front of armed criminals, promising she'd help pressure a federal agent into compliance, and that's when I realized I had an impossible choice. My mission demanded that I stay undercover at all costs. Jane had drilled it into me. Blowing my identity could unravel 2 years of work and let Morone's entire network walk free. But as a human being, watching armed thugs threaten civilians' families with kids was something I couldn't just ignore. So I did the only thing I could do. I made an anonymous tip. A concerned citizen just happening to provide license plates, physical descriptions, and timing so precise that it would look like pure coincidence when the cavalry showed up, and it worked like a movie script. Sheriff Mike Stone rolled in with backup just as the confrontation peaked. Laura's jaw literally dropped when the cruisers pulled into the lot. The two heavies instantly switched gears, putting on fake smiles and calling themselves vacation rental consultants. Stone wasn't buying it for a second. "Gentlemen," he said firmly, "we've had reports of threats in this parking lot. Care to show me some ID and explain what brings you to our peaceful community?" They produced credentials legit enough on paper, but to anyone who'd seen the underworld, it was obvious. A business front. And Sheriff Stone, thanks to Jake's earlier confession about his business debts, had already been connecting dots around the lake. The result? Jennifer Parker got her kids home safe. Bob Martinez captured the entire thing on his phone. And David Carter, well, he gave me a look. Not just curiosity, recognition. Like he knew I'd been the one pulling the strings, timing law enforcement with surgical precision. Even Laura noticed. After the officers dispersed the men with a warning, she came up to me. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "Thomas, I don't know how you did it, but thank you." If the police hadn't arrived when they did, for the first time, she understood that her scheming had put her family in real danger. But what kept me up at night wasn't her gratitude, it was the timing, Jake's harassment campaign, Laura's research. Now Vincent's men showing up in broad daylight. None of this felt random. What if the Evans family wasn't acting on their own at all? What if Marone's crew had directed them to target me? Jake, for once, was terrified. "Mom, those guys weren't kidding. If we don't get the money, they'll hurt us. Really hurt us." The kid who once bragged about treasure hunts and YouTube fame now looked like he'd aged 10 years in a day. The neighbors, on the other hand, started treating me differently. Jennifer thanked me for knowing when to call help. Bob offered his footage for the police. David? He just nodded, eyes sharp like he'd finally figured out that I wasn't just some loner consultant, but Lavra looked at me like I was both her savior and her next target. She couldn't shake the fact that no normal civilian had the resources or timing I just pulled off. And that suspicion made her more dangerous than ever, because instead of backing off, she doubled down. 2 days later, I heard a knock. Standing on my porch was a confused county inspector with a clipboard. "Mr. Harris, I'm here about a complaint regarding safety violations with your dock." Behind him, on the public beach, stood Lavra, arms crossed. Smiling like she'd just declared war, she'd filed an official complaint, claiming my dock was a hazard to public safety and the environment. 2 days after her family was nearly destroyed by violent criminals, she went right back to weaponizing bureaucracy against me. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was gasoline on a fire. Laura thought she was clever. She filed her complaint, painting me as the reckless neighbor with a dock so dangerous it supposedly threatened the entire community. She expected the county to march in, hit me with citations, and force me into expensive compliance, or better yet, into selling. But her little scheme had a fatal flaw. Jake. While the inspector stood on my dock with his clipboard, measuring tape, and checklist, Jake was nowhere to be seen. And that should have been the first warning. Because when an unstable stalker suddenly disappears in the middle of his mother's harassment campaign, he's not taking a break, he's escalating. 20 minutes into the inspection, the calls started rolling and Mrs. Wilson's boat motor wouldn't start. The Johnsons complained their dock hardware was mysteriously loose. 3 different neighbors, same morning, mechanical failures all over the lake. That's when it hit me. Jake hadn't disappeared. He'd gone mobile, and he was sabotaging boats and docks around the entire lake. The person who stopped this insanity? Frank Torres, the retired mechanic. When he spotted Jake crawling around other people's property with tools in hand, Frank's Coast Guard training came roaring back to life. "Son, what exactly do you think you're doing to that boat motor?" His voice carried like a drill. Instructor across the water. Jake froze, caught red-handed loosening mounts, disconnecting batteries and destabilizing docks. His master plan? Blame it all on me. Claim my illegal signal jammers were interfering with marine electronics. In his twisted logic, that would prove his mother's case that my property was a community hazard. But Jake didn't count on Frank. Frank didn't just call him out. He went full federal incident report mode. He photographed every bit of sabotage, documented every witness, and laid into Jake with the kind of lecture that made the rest of the neighborhood stop what they were doing. "Young man, tampering with marine safety equipment isn't vandalism. It's a federal crime. Boat motors fail on open water, people die. Dock structures collapse, swimmers drown. What you've just done isn't mischief. It's manslaughter waiting to happen." You could feel the shift instantly. The neighborhood wasn't just annoyed anymore, they were furious. Jennifer Parker rallied other parents. Bob Martinez pulled up weeks of footage to prove Jake's pattern of harassment. And David Carter watched Frank with that same expression he'd worn during the drone incident, like puzzle pieces were clicking together about who his neighbors really were. Meanwhile, the inspector finished checking my dock. He looked baffled. "Mr. Harris, this is probably the safest installation I've inspected in 20 years. Whoever built this wasn't cutting corners. They were using military-grade design." Laura's face when she heard that, priceless. Her grand plan collapsed in real time. Instead of me being cited, her son was the one caught committing federal offenses. But then something strange happened. Frank pointed out a disturbing pattern. Every single property Jake sabotaged wasn't random, it belonged to the same suspicious vacation rentals my federal task force had been watching for months. His random vandalism had just highlighted our money laundering fronts, like he was working for us. Accident or not, Jake had turned his own crime spree into a federal evidence package. And Frank? The way he handled it, the precision, the legal references, the calm authority, it was too perfect, too detailed. Either he was the most obsessive Coast Guard retiree in history, or Frank wasn't really retired at all. Even the inspector seemed shaken. He pulled me aside and whispered, "Mr. Harris, what exactly do you do? Your dock looks more like something I'd expect at a government installation." I gave my usual security consultant cover, but I could tell he didn't buy it. The aftermath was brutal for Laura. Her harassment campaign backfired spectacularly. Jake was facing criminal charges. Neighbors were uniting against her. And Frank? He looked like he was quietly building a case far bigger than vandalism. But what really made my stomach twist was the possibility that Jake's random sabotage wasn't random at all. What if someone had fed him that target list? What if Marone's people were already trying to flush me out, using Jake as their blunt instrument? And just when I thought it couldn't get worse, 48 hours later, it did, because that's when Vincent Marone's crew decided subtlety wasn't working anymore. I was in my kitchen making lunch when I heard a car door slamming way too hard, followed by shouting outside. Not the kind of shouting that comes from a neighborly disagreement. This was darker. When I looked out my window, my federal training kicked in immediately. What I saw made my blood run cold. Two men grabbed Jake from his mother's driveway as he was getting into his car. These weren't the clueless business consultants from the grocery lot. No, these guys moved with precision, professional muscle. Their stance, their formation, it screamed military or law enforcement training. Within seconds, Jake was pinned at gunpoint near the public dock, while Laura stood frozen 20 feet away on the verge of collapse. $50,000. One of them barked, his voice cutting across the water like a blade. "Vincent's patience is gone. You've stalled for weeks. Now you've got 2 hours. Pay or your son learns what happens to people who waste Marone's time." This wasn't debt collection anymore. This was an execution countdown. The neighborhood snapped into panic. Jennifer Parker yanked her kids inside, clutching her phone. Like a lifeline, probably calling 911. Bob Martinez? He had his camera rolling, but wisely stayed behind the curtains. David Carter was calculating, could he intervene without getting Jake killed? Nobody had an answer. Everyone knew. This was life or death now. Laura, voice shaking, tried to bargain. "Please, just more time. I can get the money. Thomas Harris has resources. I just need him to help us." And that's when it hit me. She was trying to drag me into her family's mess. Even while her son was one trigger pull away from execution, I had 30 seconds. 30 seconds to decide between two nightmares: stay hidden, protect my cover, and pray law enforcement arrived in time, or blow 2 years of federal Undercover work to stop these men myself. My oath as an agent wouldn't let me stand by. I called Jane on the emergency line while grabbing gear no tech consultant should own. Jane, we need immediate tactical response. Hostage situation. It's Marone's people. I'm blowing cover. Her pause was ice cold. Thomas. If you reveal now, we lose everything. 23 arrests. 50 million in seizures. 2 years of work. But Jake's screams cut through the line. One of the gunmen grew restless, pressing the barrel tighter as Jake spiraled into a breakdown. Lavra was sobbing, begging, threatening lawsuits chaos. Swirling with loaded weapons. By the time Jane arrived with a tactical team, suburbia transformed into a war zone. Black SUVs, body armor, formation so sharp it made Sheriff Stone's deputies look like mall cops. Jane's voice boomed across the water. This is Agent Cross, FBI. You are surrounded. Release the hostage now. The entire community froze. Their quiet lake life just shattered. Federal agents had been living among them, investigating in plain sight. David Carter's jaw dropped, vindication written all over his face. Jennifer Parker clutched her kids, staring at my cabin like it was Area 51. Bob Martinez? He was practically drooling. This was the documentary gold of his career. The takedown was textbook. Coordinated angles, overwhelming force, no room for resistance. The kidnappers surrendered. Jake was shaken, screaming, but alive. His first words, "Wait, you're FBI? I've been stalking an FBI agent? Oh my God, I'm going to prison forever." Laura's reaction was equal parts gratitude and horror. "Thomas, thank you for saving my son's life. But this means I've been harassing the FBI. My life is over." She wasn't wrong. Obstructing federal work carries a price tag she wasn't ready to pay. And the neighbors? Instead of anger, there was relief. The puzzle pieces finally fit. The high-tech doc. My calm under pressure. My timing with every law enforcement response. David said it best. So that explains everything. Sheriff Stone pulled up just as my federal team wrapped the scene. His face was priceless. "Thomas, when I told you to upgrade your security, I didn't think you already had your own tactical squad." The aftermath was surreal. Agents interviewed neighbors. Jake headed for psychiatric evaluation before federal charges. Lavra realized her harassment campaign had helped us gather evidence against Marone's crew. The irony was thick enough to choke on, but Jane wasn't celebrating. She pulled me aside. "Thomas, we've got a bigger problem. Now Marone knows we're here. Every target will scatter or torch evidence. We've got 48 hours before the network evaporates." Jake's life was saved, but our investigation? Hanging by a thread. And the worst part? I couldn't shake the feeling none of this was coincidence. Jake's harassment, Laura's legal games, the pressure from creditors, now a staged hostage. Crisis that forced our hand, too neat, too perfect. Someone wanted us exposed. Either this was the biggest coincidence in law enforcement history, or someone had been pulling strings to expose federal operations right here at our lake. With our cover blown after the hostage crisis, Jane had no choice but to push the entire money laundering investigation into overdrive. The clock was ticking 48 hours before every criminal in this network either vanished or burned their evidence. So Jane did something I never thought I'd see. She gathered the entire neighborhood inside the lakeside pavilion for what she called a security briefing. In reality, it was the most surreal federal intelligence reveal I'd ever witnessed. Jennifer Parker sat with her kids. Bob Martinez had his camera rolling like he just won the lottery. David Carter looked like a kid on Christmas morning. And Lavra Evans, she sat in the back pale like she was at her own funeral. Then Jane stepped forward. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Agent Jane Cross, FBI Financial Crimes Division. For the past 6 months, Agent Thomas Harris has been running surveillance on a sophisticated money laundering network operating through vacation rental properties around this lake. Silence. You could hear the air shift in the room. Jane's words turned our entire neighborhood drama into something out of a crime thriller. But the real shock came when Frank Torres stood up from the back. Agent Cross, he said, pulling out federal ID, I think it's time I introduce myself properly. I'm Agent Frank Torres, Coast Guard Investigative Service. I've been undercover here for 2 years, monitoring maritime traffic and rental operations under federal protection. The man I thought was just a retired mechanic? He'd been my partner all along. Suddenly, everything clicked. His expertise with maritime law during Jake's sabotage, his meticulous evidence gathering, his uncanny timing. He hadn't just been nosy, he'd been running parallel surveillance the whole time. Jane broke down the network. Vincent Marone's crew had laundered $50 million over 3 years. They used fake vacation rental bookings, cash payments, and property investments to wash dirty money. Our lake was chosen because of its valuable real estate and constant flow of outsiders. And Jake Evans? His chaotic sabotage spree turned out to be a twisted stroke of luck. The properties he damaged weren't random. They were the exact rentals being used as laundering hubs. His drone obsession had accidentally captured drops, meetings, and operations federal teams had struggled to nail down for years. David Carter raised his hand, almost like he was in class. Wait, are you saying Jake's drone videos were actually federal evidence? Jane nodded. Yes, his footage documented meetings and money movements we couldn't otherwise access. In his own way, Jake was filming the case that might bring Marone down. From the back, Laura Evans whispered, her voice breaking, are you telling me that while I was trying to force Thomas to sell his cabin, I was actually obstructing a federal investigation into the very criminals threatening my son? The irony was brutal. Weeks of harassment, all while protecting the people destroying her family. But then Frank dropped the real bomb. These rentals weren't just laundering hubs. They were recruitment centers. People drowning in debt got offered fake partnerships or sponsorships, and once they signed, they were trapped. Jake's treasure hunting deal? It wasn't business. It was a scheme to force him into debt slavery. Photos flashed on the projector, innocent-looking family BBQs that were actually money drops. Grocery runs hiding cash deliveries. Game nights masking money-counting sessions. Our peaceful lake community had been a criminal hub in disguise. Jennifer Parker's face twisted with anger. Are you saying my kids were playing near houses being used to launder millions? That this wasn't just Jake being a lunatic, this was organized crime operating under our noses? The room buzzed with shock and fear. And then Frank revealed the worst part. Marone's people knew federal agents were here. Your cover was good, Harris, but they ran counterintelligence. Jake's harassment wasn't random, it was encouraged. A way to probe our defenses and force exposure. By the time Jane finished, the scale was staggering. 23 rental properties tied to laundering. 47 individuals from property managers to couriers. $50 million scrubbed through what looked like family vacations. And all of it had been happening right where we lived. Our quiet little lake community hadn't just been unlucky. It had been the financial hub for one of the region's most powerful criminal organizations. The twist? Laura's legal research, the same paperwork she'd weaponized to harass me, turned out to be a goldmine for federal investigators. Her detailed mapping of rental agreements, shell companies, and property transfers created an accidental blueprint of the laundering network. She'd thought she was building a harassment case against me, but in reality, she was giving the FBI the evidence they needed to dismantle Marone's empire. And Jake's debt? It wasn't some random bad business decision. Jane dropped the bombshell. The $50,000 wasn't an accident. It was a recruitment trap, designed to lock Jake, and by extension his entire family, into criminal obligations. Laura's legal expertise and Jake's tech skills weren't coincidentally in play. They were targeted because the organization wanted them as tools. Frank's maritime surveillance filled in the rest of the picture. Every weekend boat ride the community thought was normal recreation. In reality, it was a multi-million-dollar supply chain moving dirty cash between rental houses disguised as vacation getaways. The truth hit the room like a thunderclap. Our so-called neighborhood drama hadn't just crossed paths with a federal case. It was the case, and then Jane delivered the hammer. Based on 6 months of intelligence, much of it unknowingly supplied by civilian activity, coordinated raids will begin immediately. Within 24 hours, every criminal operation tied to this lake will be dismantled. For 2 years, this network had operated unchecked. Now it was about to implode in a single day. The following morning, the lake woke up to the largest federal financial crime bust in state history. What unfolded wasn't law enforcement. It was a military precision operation. By dawn, 23 properties were hit simultaneously. Jane's team swarmed safe houses while Frank's Coast Guard units sealed the water. I stood on my deck watching blacklight agents raid the very rental house Jake's drone had filmed over and over. What we thought was a family vacation spot turned out to be a counting room for millions in cash. And Vincent Marone. He didn't escape in some flashy car. He tried to sneak out in a beat-up fishing boat loaded with $2 million in cash and years of incriminating records. Frank's maritime surveillance had tracked every possible route, and federal boats boxed him in before he got halfway across the water. The man who once terrified the Evans family ended up handcuffed, soaked and humiliated, dragged from the lake like the criminal he was. But here's where irony reached its peak. Jake's manic obsession, his stalking, his drone flights, his shaky phone videos ended up being prosecution gold. He'd filmed money drops, counting sessions, and meetings from angles that federal surveillance teams couldn't legally capture. The kid thought he was building a case against me, but every clip he uploaded was evidence against Marone's crew. And Lavra? Her legal harassment strategy was hailed by prosecutors as the most detailed civilian intelligence package in financial crime history. She'd unwittingly mapped ownership structures, financial links, and transaction chains investigators might have spent years untangling. The neighborhood watched in stunned disbelief as one rental after another was raided. Jennifer Parker explained to her kids that the friendly vacation families had actually been laundering millions. Bob Martinez filmed every second for his channel, documenting federal agents hauling duffel bags of evidence. And David Carter, with his military eye, could only shake his head and say, "This is federal task force precision. They've been lining this up for months." By the end of the sweep, the numbers were staggering. $53 million in cash, assets, and property seized. Criminal records, hard drives, and ledgers pulled from innocent lake houses. A network of 47 individuals dismantled overnight. Our peaceful lake community had been exposed as a hub for organized crime and just as quickly dismantled before our eyes. Jake's accidental role in one of the biggest federal busts in state history was almost unbelievable. Every frantic clip he filmed of me, every shaky video, every drone flyover contained damning evidence he hadn't even realized he was gathering. What he thought was proof of my wrongdoing became the FBI's most valuable surveillance package. Couriers, meetings, laundering sessions, it was all there. His manic obsession handed investigators what years of surveillance hadn't. Laura's case was more complicated. She had obstructed a federal investigation, but her motives weren't rooted in greed. They were born out of desperation to protect her family. And ironically, her obsessive legal digging turned into the most comprehensive civilian intelligence package federal prosecutors had ever seen. What she thought was a harassment campaign was actually helping dismantle a $53 million criminal empire. As arrests rolled in, the full picture became clear. The property managers were laundering coordinators. The boat captains were couriers. Even vacation renters were actually crime bosses holding meetings under the guise of family getaways. Our entire lake had been a disguise, a community-wide stage for organized crime. Frank's double life finally came into focus. His supposed retirement had really been federal cover. 2 years undercover with the Coast Guard, documenting smuggling routes and linking them to financial networks across states. His work was hailed as one of the most successful covert operations in Coast Guard history, but what struck me most was how the neighborhood reacted. Instead of feeling violated, people were proud. Jennifer threw a potluck to thank agents and neighbors who'd cooperated. Bob immediately started drafting a documentary about the lake community that helped the FBI. The national media swarmed us, and suddenly, our once troubled community was famous for all the right reasons. The justice system balanced mercy with accountability. Jake, finally diagnosed with bipolar disorder, received community service and mandatory treatment instead of prison. He went from stalking me with a camera to helping veterans with tech projects, and even launched a YouTube channel on mental health awareness, turning his nightmare into advocacy. Lavra wasn't so lucky. Disbarred, bankrupt, and on probation, she went from self-proclaimed HOA queen to stocking shelves at the local grocery store. Her story became a cautionary tale about how desperation and misplaced control can destroy everything you're fighting to protect. Frank Torres, now openly celebrated, was elected HOA president on a campaign of safety and federal cooperation. His first act? Memorial plaques honoring the neighbors who had unknowingly helped bring down organized crime. And the ripple effects? Property values soared by 40%. Families flocked to buy homes at what had once been a crime hub, eager to live in a community where federal agents had literally swept organized crime off the lake. Jennifer considered cashing out to move her kids to better schools. Bob, once just a neighborhood watchdog with a camera, became a respected crime journalist. His footage was purchased by national outlets, and he began writing a book about how ordinary civilians helped federal agents pull off one of the biggest busts in regional history. 6 months later, I sat on my deck with the calmest cup of coffee I'd had in years. The same lake that once hid million-dollar criminal deals now shimmered with peace. Looking back, it felt almost surreal. What started as petty HOA harassment spiraled into one of the most ironic cinematic takedowns imaginable. Justice didn't just arrive, it crashed in like a tidal wave. And that's why you should always keep your eyes open in your own neighborhood. You never know what's happening behind those perfect lawns and smiling faces. If this story blew your mind, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and join us here on Listen HOA Stories for even more unbelievable true stories from communities just like yours. David Carter quickly turned his experience into a mission. He began offering veteran-led security consultations to nearby communities worried about criminal infiltration. With his military background and first-hand knowledge of federal operations, he became a sought-after speaker at safety seminars. For me, the recognition was career-defining. 2 years of living undercover, building a case that led to the takedown of one of the region's largest laundering networks, earned me commendations from multiple agencies. My quiet lake cabin was now used as a case study location, a textbook example of how community-based undercover operations can dismantle organized crime without tipping off the suspects. But the real justice was poetic. Jake's manic harassment campaign ended up producing The most complete evidence package prosecutors could dream of. Laura's legal obstruction became the blueprint for mapping out the network's property structures. Even Vincent Marone's ruthless debt collection tactics connected investigative dots that surveillance alone could never have revealed. Our once divided community had rallied around its role in law enforcement history. Jennifer started an annual agent appreciation barbecue. Bob was already planning a documentary film festival about civilians aiding federal prosecutions. Frank launched a community watch program modeled on his undercover methods. And Rachel Kim, whose Lake Life Chronicles blog had gone viral, mid-investigation landed a book deal and TV spots about how social media can play a role in uncovering crime. The seized vacation rental properties were repurposed as legitimate family getaways managed under federal forfeiture programs. Criminal cash paid for new docks, upgraded security, and even community parks. The very assets used to launder money were now funding neighborhood improvements. And just when we thought peace had finally settled over the lake, the cycle threatened to begin again. The Evans foreclosed property was bought by new neighbors who clearly hadn't done their homework. Within weeks, their behavior felt uncomfortably familiar. A teenage son with attitude problems. A lawyer. Mother who thought HOA rules didn't apply to her. Complaints about my security equipment. Whispered questions about my cabin's privacy measures. Frank had already started quietly documenting their behavior with the same precision he once used on Jake. Bob kept his camera rolling, ready to archive every word. Jennifer rallied parents to keep an eye on anything suspicious around the kids. And David walked up to me yesterday with a knowing grin. Thomas, I think it's time we have another community meeting about respecting federal law enforcement. This time, though, there was no fear, only confidence. After everything we had been through, this community was ready to shut down any harassment before it spiraled out of control. These new neighbors had no idea what kind of neighborhood they'd just moved into. And honestly, after surviving Laura and Jake, I think you can imagine how we'll handle round two. If you want to hear what happens when the new family tries their luck against a community that's already battle-tested, let me know in the comments. Trust me, it only gets better from here. You made it to the end, now treat yourself to the next story. Because trust me, the madness isn't over yet.